welcome, I guess, to the Creativity and Wellbeing, Empowering Learners to Thrive in a Complex and Fast-Changing World. My name is Stuart Mcintyre. My day job is a data coach for Forth Valley and West Lothian Regional Improvement Collaborative, which is a challenge to get in a name tag and even more of a challenge to try and explain to people what it is I actually do. Essentially, data, creativity don't really go hand in hand, especially if you've spent any time in schools recently. Data tends to be about reading ages or numeracy and literacy achievement of a level, or SNSA bands, or GL assessments, or single word spelling tests. We still do those, but you get the gist of it. The things that are relatively easy to measure. However, my role focuses much more on leading schools or settings in conversations to support them to identify the things that really matter to them, the things that really matter to their communities, to their young people, and then working out how the heck we identify progress and impact in those things. And during these conversations, it's amazing how often it does come back to creativity. And possibly even more amazing is how many settings already have creativity as one of their school values, yet pay little to no attention to whether young people are more creative or less creative as a result of their schooling there. FYI, the answer is always less creative as a result of their schooling. And hopefully this will help demonstrate why. So what I'd like you to do is I'm going to give 2 minutes for this, just to gather as many ideas as possible around when do you feel at your most creative. So you can either speak if you want to speak, that's absolutely fine, or if you're shy, stick it in the chat pane. But think about all the factors that lead to you feeling at your most creative. It might be the people, it might be the place, it might be the task, but have a think. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to do that, and your time for us to gather as many thoughts and ideas for that starts now. When do you feel at your most creative?
Can you see the chat okay, Stuart?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I've closed the presentation so that I can see the chat briefly. So lots of ideas starting to appear in the chat there, lots of interesting ideas as well. If you've not got something in yet, you've got 20 seconds, but feel free to keep adding once I start talking again. I like the interesting contradiction of when I have time and space and then when I have time pressure. I'm one of those people that need the fear. I've known I've been doing this presentation for about a month, possibly 2 months, and I finished the slide deck at 3:40 because I needed the fear in order to actually get it done. So I'm going to put the presentation back up. Thanks for all the ideas that are in there so far. So generally, when I used to be able to ask this question in a real life room with real life people in it, they would share these sorts of things. And you have shared very similar ideas. When you're comfortable, that balance again of pressure to act, time to think. When you're passionate about something, again, somebody mentioned that. Resources being available, I'm not sure if that was mentioned in there. Confidence, when you're around people, certain people have that impact. When you're inspired, that definitely came in there. Knowledgeable, people generally feel like when it's something they're passionate about or they know about, then they feel like they can be more creative around it. And at the most inconvenient times as well. Now, these are the things that get shared, and these are the sorts of things that you put in the chat. But when I used to walk around a room, the thing that I would actually hear most often is, oh, I'm not that creative, or words to those effect. Oh, not like Susie in her hearts. I'm not creative like her. Now, this platform doesn't really allow for those whispers of true insights, unless somebody accidentally leaves their mic on. I don't get to hear those inner thoughts. But I'd be willing to guess that even in a space that is filled with people that have voluntarily shown up to explore creativity, so presumably have some interest in creativity, that thought of, I'm not really that creative, entered into the thinking of at least a few people. Now, if it was you, don't worry, I'm not going to expect you to share, but if questioned why you feel that way, most people can usually pinpoint a particular moment or an experience or a person who made them feel this way. And then since then, it's just kind of stuck ever since. This moment that makes people feel like they're not creative also usually happens during school. So for me, it was primary 6, the school production, standing at the back row, because I was one of the tall people, so I was in the back row, singing my heart out. And somebody in the front row, who shall remain nameless, Hannah Gallagher, turned round and gave me the filthiest look. And I might have been singing too loud, or I might have been singing the wrong words, or I might have been singing massively out of tune, or all three. It is absolutely possible. But that very moment made me feel that, well, singing was not the creative outlet for me. It probably didn't help that I had a massive crush on her at the time as well, but that is totally beside the point. But for the sake of all of those people that have their own Hannah Gallagher experience, because although I love music, since that day I have never sung a note in public ever since. I think it's important that we dispel a few of the creativity myths that might impact that as well. So things like, it's only for genius or talented individuals. Well, it might help, but it's certainly not the only way that we can be creative. It appears as a brief moment of inspiration, a flash. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. You need to be born with it. You can't learn it. You absolutely can be taught to be creative. You can be taught creative processes, just like numeracy or literacy. It is something that we can develop. Creative people always have good ideas. I think if you speak to people that are deemed to be creative, they would say they spend a lot of their time in creative blocks, not having good ideas. And it's the getting through it that is what they spend most of their time doing. Or creative ideas is enough to be successful. A lot of the time it's the execution and the people that you surround yourself with. I would also add to that list, it's all about the arts. So while my example was about something within the arts, it is absolutely not about just the arts. And I promise you this is not a paid ad, but I genuinely believe that the creativity web that was shared by the Creative Learning Network is just an incredible tool for supporting teachers and ultimately young people to rethink their perceptions around creativity. It supports me in my role to begin to measure how creative are you. But more importantly, it also allows you to reframe the question to how are you creative? And it stops people believing that they're not creative, because creativity comes in all sorts of unexpected forms, whether that's curiosity or open-mindedness or imagination or problem solving. So as an example, my gran, who is late 80s, early 90s, probably, I should probably know that, does not deem herself as creative. I think she's long since given up on the aspiration of a job in the creative industries. But I remember sitting in a coffee shop with her. She'd eaten half of her cake, which is just wrong on so many levels, but we're not going to get into that. And it was a sponge cake with a big, thick layer of cream at the top. And she decided she's just going to take it home and finish it later. And I sat there thinking, there is no way that gets home in one piece. Even at the pace that she walks, there is no way that makes it home. And then she took the cake and sliced it in half, horizontally, that's right, and then inverted it so that the cream was in the middle, so that it went sponge, cream, sponge, and then wrapped it in her napkin and put it in her bag. And I sat there thinking that was absolute genius. And that is creative problem solving. And that's the creativity that we often miss. Similarly, Susie, who I mentioned, when I was in one of the schools talking about creativity, she shared about a project that she'd been doing during the initial lockdown, where she recognized that there was hundreds of people, probably way more than that, thousands, that had loved ones in hospital that they were not able to visit. Not necessarily COVID related, but in hospital and unable to visit. And she created these beautiful little hearts made out of materials and then stuffed, that she created in pairs, and they were all unique pairs. And then with the permission of, it was St John's Hospital that she was working alongside, one of the hearts would go into the hospital with the person that was there, and the other heart would go to the family that were stuck at home, so that they had this tangible, real connection at a time that they couldn't be together. Now, the making of the hearts is creative, but it was more about recognizing the problem and coming up with a solution that was really interesting and how it made people feel connected at a time when they felt really separated. So, the big problem that we have is that schools don't actually facilitate any of these things. All of the traditions, the rules, the undeniable constraints that we have in school do not help you to feel at your most creative. School is the box that is impossible to fit these things into properly. How can you have time when, as a young person, you're not in control of your time? As a teacher, you're not in control of your time. You don't even get to choose when you go to the toilet or when you eat. So how can you have time to have that pressure, or time to think, when we still have numeracy in the morning, literacy in the afternoon, and if we have time, we'll get to topic and beyond that. Or when you have bells controlling your day, or snack times, or lunch times. How can you have passions guiding what you're doing when you don't get to choose what you learn about most of the time? And then some of the time teachers aren't even passionate about what they're teaching because it's what they are told they have to teach. Resources. We also don't even give resources open access. Glitter is locked away until Christmas, or Mother's Day at a push. Resources are just not readily available. So schools do not help you to feel like you're most creative. Now, I hope at least one person has sat there and thought, why is Taylor Swift's name on that slide? Well, much to my wife's displeasure, I am unapologetically an absolute Swiftie, which should be good enough reason just to stick her name on slides anyway, but it does actually relate to a specific quote that was attributed to her during the first lockdown, which was, during extreme times, we can cling on to the familiar with everything we've got, or we can enter into such times with a frontier mentality. Now, in my role, I am extremely fortunate to get to meet and connect incredible people in schools who absolutely personify that frontier mentality. People and places who learn from each other and really question this thing that we call school and how we can do it differently in order to let creativity happen. So one of the things that I've learned since attending lots of education conferences is that those the big fancy keynote speakers always use metaphors so that you'll remember them and then you'll talk about them and then they'll get invited back. Well, I'm not one of those fancy keynote speakers. They tend not to do Thursday afternoons at 4 o'clock. But I am going to attempt to spin a metaphor for you anyway. So, as mentioned, schools and the system that we all work within have constraints. And the constraints aren't going away. So there is absolutely no point in me sharing my tales of working in private schools where these constraints just don't exist and they have much more freedom. Our constraints are our dots. And school is a giant dot to dot. And most settings, probably logically, see it as a dot to dot to be completed like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when I set teachers this task, that's exactly what they do too. Side note, there is one exception, and that people sometimes will join 5 back to 1. I have no idea why somebody would do that. I can only conclude that they are absolute sociopaths. The schools that I'm about to mention just look at the dot to dot differently, and they think, what if we did this? The constraints are still met. They've still gone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But what they've done is something way more imaginative. Dot to dot rebels, if you like. Now, this was advertised as a choose your own adventure, and you've done very little choosing up until this point. But what I'd like you to do is consider, from the 3 schools that I'm about to give you an overlay of, which dot to dot rebels you'd like to hear more about. So, there are 3 schools, and I'm going to put the numbers 1, 2, 3 in the chat shortly, and then you can vote for the one that you would like to hear more about. So number 1 is about unplanning with absolute focus, a school that rethought how they're going to do planning with far less structure, but just as much rigor. Number 2 is a work in progress, and it is a school that I'm currently working with who are looking at free zones, not classrooms. So taking down this whole construct of children in classrooms and one teacher in one class and thinking about, so what if we totally rethought the space that we have? And number 3 is timetables for thriving, which is looking at how we take apart timetables and how we give much more ownership to those timetables in a way that helps facilitate that feeling creative, the things that we have just talked about. So I am briefly going to unshare, and in the chat put number 1, 2, 3 so that you can vote for the one that you would like to. So just put a thumbs up next to Mrs. Gill. You're all, well, stop. You're all very keen. Pause. I am going to put 1, 2, 3, and you are going to put a thumbs up next to the one that you want, because that way I don't have to go back through the feed and count all the numbers. I just have to count the thumbs up that are next to it. Awesome. Now you can put a thumbs up next to the one that you would like to hear more about. Okay, so it would look like 3 is the most popular choice at the moment. Side note, if you ever think of doing a presentation and you are going to give 3 choices, please be fully aware that 2/3 of your work is absolutely pointless because nobody ever gets to see it, which I only really registered while I was doing all the work for this. But I will now go to slide number 3 and start to share that with you. So, timetables for thriving. Here we go. So the situation that there was it was a primary 6-7 class, but it quickly spread beyond the 6-7 class, where there were high levels of traditional pupil attainment, and they were looking to increase pupil responsibility, organisational skills, and self-awareness. And they wanted to provide a much more flexible learning timetable. So the first thing that they did was they looked at the flexible week, which, I mean, I'm pretty sure was around when I was in school, which is this idea of, rather than telling people what they need to do and when they need to do it, and this is math time and this is numeracy time, pupils would get told, these are all the tasks that you need to complete by the end of the week. Make sure you fit them in where you want. So they had a look at this, and they looked at schools that were already doing this, and the two teachers that were working on it pretty much concluded it's a good starting point, but it's nowhere near as ambitious as we want to be. So they started asking what ifs. They thought it was good for increasing responsibility. It was great for potentially developing those organisational skills that gave a good context for those. There was lots of pros, but they wanted to know, how can we better connect activity to productivity to timing, and then promote authentic personalisation and choice. So they started thinking about energy levels. This idea that at different points of the day, you are more and less appropriate to do certain tasks. So there'll be points of the day where you feel green, you are focused and productive and in good spirits. And there'll be points of the day where you feel yellow. You're neither at your best or your worst. You're just kind of like in the middle. Come see, come sa. And then there'll be points of the day where you are red, where you feel sluggish and you struggle to pay any sort of attention whatsoever. And they recognised that this might be different for different people. But we were still in the habit of putting our creative things at the end of the day, where you're most likely to be red, sluggish, struggling to pay attention. So the process that they went through, and it was an extended process, was they first wanted to get pupils aware of this. They wanted to raise pupils' awareness of how they felt and when they were productive and when they were least productive, and to own that to a certain extent, because as the quote says, thriving occurs when your time, your energy, and your priorities are in sync. There are certain tasks that are better at certain times. So when you're feeling green, those are the times that it's best for developing gifts and passions. Those things that you love doing, do them during your green times. That's when you improve your skills. It's when new learning happens. And it's times where you want to make an impact, or times where you can be making an impact. Yellow times, good for those sort of moderately important or medium tasks, or larger group discussions and activities. It's a good time for group work. And then those red times are probably good for those sort of routine admin tasks, like a worksheet, or exercise is another thing that's really good at those times. And they wanted pupils to recognise this, so that when they had that freedom that a flexible week provided, they were then using it effectively. They weren't just doing all the things that they really wanted to do first. They were thinking about, when is the best time to do this? So they started off by, they would ring a bell, and each pupil had their own diary, and it was split into time sections. And across the course of the week, they would ring a bell at certain points of the day, and then each pupil would register how they were feeling at that time and what they were doing, so that they had that information that at the end of the week, they could start to analyse, actually, between 8 and 9, I generally feel green. That's a good time. But then there's this lull between 9 and 10 where I'm good for nothing. And that sluggish part kicks in. My breakfast wears off. I'm just feeling I just need to do something low-grade admin work. But then I can feel better after that. And there's a spell in the middle of the day where it's a bit easy-ozy either way. And then there's that one green spell again towards the end of the day where I can be creative again, or I feel like that's where I want to pursue my passions. And they also had a list of things that they were doing when they felt green as well, that were potential spirit lifters. So maybe they were doing PE and actually they felt good because of what they were doing, not necessarily the time. Or they felt like they were tired, but sometimes a really good conversation or a chilled conversation helps to lift their spirits. Or a quick game. Like, these are the sorts of things that when I don't feel productive, these are the things that help lift my spirits. So the young people were way more aware of all of these things so that they could take much more meaningful ownership over what they were actually doing and how they were splitting up their week. And then the teachers split up the tasks and gave different types of tasks so that there were self-set tasks in there as well. It wasn't a case of every single task that you have to complete this week is something that a teacher wants you to do, or the teacher has decided this is what you want to do. Those were still in there, but those were to be self-located. There were certain things that were fixed that at that time they weren't able to move, but it is something they're experimenting with now in terms of, does lunch need to be at the same time for everyone? But at the time that they were working on this, it did. So then young people were able to look at their timetable, their personalised colour-coded timetable, and start to plan their days so that they would put the best things at the best time. So the example that I have here was this young person decided that their self-directed learning project, I will zoom in slightly so that you should be able to see it a bit. Their self-directed learning project was the best thing that they should work on in the morning. And then they would spend that red time doing emails because they had an extended network of experts that they could work with. It wasn't all about the teacher being the expert in that school. So they would then spend some time emailing people to ask about their project. They'd been working on their project, now email somebody to ask some questions. Email, generally low-grade admin. But they would also go a 5K timed run because they felt that always lifted their spirits. The next green point, they were really interested in developing their coding skills at the moment, so that they would work on that during that point as well, because they wanted to create something and they were trying to make develop new skills doing that, and that's a good time to develop new skills. That yellow period in the middle of the day is where they generally put a lot of the teacher assigned tasks, because a lot of the teacher assigned tasks lent themselves to not having to have a great deal of intense focus. It was about maths activities or watching and receiving information or community group talk as well. They also recognised that the creative writing activity that the teacher set would be best done at a time where they feel green, because that is when they're at their most creative. So they put that creative writing activity at that point. Updating their online learning log, very little brain power required for that. It's a regurgitation of their day, so that went at the end of the day. This had a massive impact. The results that the teacher shared was that by being given more ownership and a different structure to build their ownership around, young people enjoyed it far more. They felt like there was more to it than simply just putting tasks in boxes and making sure they got all their work done by the end of the week. There was much more influence that they were able to exert on it, and they were able to know why they were doing a certain thing, and they could talk confidently about why they were doing something at a certain time or why they were not doing something at a certain time. They displayed a massive increase of ownership of learning and curiosity as well. Because they were doing the things that they were passionate about at a time that they felt green, they were far more inquisitive and curious because they were in the right mindset for doing it. And that creativity spiked as well. And their confidence grew. They were confident in their own abilities, and their teachers became more confident in the pupils' ability to self-direct because they were doing it with purpose and they were doing it with knowledge behind it as well. When I went back and spoke to the teachers, the things that they reflected on was that the experience really challenged the role of a teacher in terms of what their role was for their learning. And while creativity was not a focus, it began to develop naturally and abundantly. And that's where we come back to that idea of, if we create the space and the environment where we can feel creative, and creativity happens. It happens at the most inconvenient time, and this timetable allowed that to be facilitated. In similar future endeavours, they thought it would be useful to have a wider network of specialists so that they could create more personalisation and choice. So two of the things that they have started working on since then is they've thought about how they pitch the teacher work as well. So rather than it always being work that should be done in the yellow time, because it became quite apparent that they reflected on a lot of the work that we're doing doesn't actually require that much thought. It's not about new learning. A lot of it is regurgitating what they already know. They started pitching it like this, so that these cards, this is essentially 4 cards, that could be split up so that those cards could be placed at different point in the timetable as well. And these were tasks that had a creative element to them, but also resulted in far less predictable work and a much greater variety of work, but still conformed to certain expectations that the teacher would add on that 4th slide. So they wanted young people to be ideating and coming up with different ways that they could present learning or different topics they could be exploring and prototyping. They wanted them to be working on things, failing fast, and reiterating. They wanted to build these creative skills into that timetable as well. Where they had seen creativity flourishing, they wanted to develop that by adding creative processes there. They wanted to add personalization and choice in terms of there were some young people that were really good at identifying those self-directed tasks that they were able to go, oh, I'm going to start coding or I'm going to create a personal project. But there were some that really benefited from that opportunity to engage with different professionals, different experts. So they added offerings as well. So they became fixed parts on the timetable, but they were absolutely optional. So that they would know a Tuesday between 8 and 9:30, there was going to be a Lego master builder come in that was going to do a workshop on creativity and problem solving using Lego. And pupils could opt in to that experience if that is what they wanted to put in their timetable. Or there was an outdoor boot camp for PE Thursday 1 till 4, and they could opt into these things. And everything, all the offerings were exactly that. It was an offering that they could either attend or they didn't have to. But it gave that framework again for young people to pursue new interests or to develop those interests too. I have done my best to explain that process and everything that was involved in it, but I have no doubt missed out things. So what I'd like to do is give 7-8 minutes for any questions that you might have right now about what I've tried to explain, and probably pick out the things that I've just glossed over that you probably want more information about. So I'm going to close the presentation right now and open it up to you for questions. Now, what I didn't mention at the start is one of my core values as a teacher, as an educator, is that power lies in the quality of the question asked. So when I attend meetings, even if they're really dull, I sit there going, well, it's my responsibility to make sure that I ask a question that is going to make sure that I got something out of this meeting. I can't put the blame on the person that's chairing the meeting if I walk away having taken nothing from it. That also is an excellent get-out clause when I'm leading presentations, because, you know, if you walk away from this thinking that was garbage and I took nothing from that, well, maybe you should have asked a better question. So this is your opportunity to ask those questions so that you do take something from it, because I would hate for you to walk away from this and not take anything from it. So your time, ask a question.
I think Mrs. Gill's got her hand up. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Stuart. I really enjoyed that actually, and my P7 daughter had just come in from school, and I brought her along and I said, listen to this, would you like to do this? And she was like, that would be so much better because I don't like doing numeracy first thing on a Monday morning. So just shows you. But I can totally see how that would work in a primary classroom when you've got the young people all day, every day. And I wonder, and I would really like to explore how that would work in a secondary setting. And because we've got so much work to do in terms of making the things a little bit more creative, and we have to be more creative with our timetabling, so we don't put them in 50-minute blocks of time, which is part of the issue. But I don't know if you've any thoughts on that or any kind of insight into how it might work in a different sector.
So my area of expertise is certainly not secondary school. And I know I wouldn't share, I said I wouldn't share tales of private schools, but the majority of my experience at secondary is within the private school that I worked in, because it was a super campus, so it was a 3 to 18 campus. And it's not a direct solution, but it's an interesting sort of jumping off point, is the way that they timetabled subjects or time was that social subjects pupils were timetabled for social subjects, and then they had access to the 4 social subject teachers at that point, and they could move between any of the teachers that they felt were most relevant to what they were doing at that time. Similarly with sciences and languages. So there was that degree of, yes, it's secondary school, so there's more of a challenge in terms of that timetabling, but they sort of clustered the timetabling a bit more. It would certainly be something I'd love to have a conversation about, because I think it's an area that I think there's so much potential, because you have this breadth of experts in a secondary school that primary schools don't benefit from, yet we don't open up that access to them particularly well. So I think it'd be great to have a conversation about that in the future and possibly explore that more.
Would absolutely love to. Brilliant. Yeah.
I'll just come in there, and since there's a silence, I've just popped a link in the chat there from Kemney Academy in Aberdeenshire. I'm not saying it's the solution to everything, but they've got some really interesting creative ideas about how to have a different approach to the curriculum. So it might be worth having a look at and see if there are things from there that you can adapt and amend in your own settings. So just thought I'd pop that in.
Thank you very much. Matthew, I think your hand's up.
Hello, Stuart. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm interested in the circumstances that we find ourselves in right now in terms of late March 2022, and people are very tired. What do you say to people who kind of fold their arms and look at you and say, but that will never work?
I mean, it sounds like a total get-out answer, but I think any of the schools that I mentioned, any of the 3, and there are many more, but those are the 3 examples that I picked, that mentality simply doesn't exist there. And for those people that go, yeah, but that'll never work, I direct them to those schools and say, go and speak to those practitioners, go and ask them. Because while there was loads of conversations around COVID and how awful it was and how it was impacting everything we do in school, within these settings, the C word, as we called it, was barely mentioned, because they were so excited about all the changes that they were making and all these different things that they were doing that it wasn't the main topic of conversation. And I think for me to sit here and say, no, it's absolutely awesome, I don't think it will ever have the impact than that a teacher speaking to another teacher or a group of teachers speaking to another teacher will have, because they have lived it, they've experienced it, they've encountered the problems, and they've found the solutions. I get to be that sort of person that sits on the side and asks all the questions and then shares their experiences or connects those experiences with other people. So I think ultimately teacher to teacher and that ground up is the only way to change some of those attitudes.
Can I come back with that? Not wanting to steal the show, but I'm very interested in what Stuart does and how Stuart thinks. I concur completely, Stuart, that teachers are possibly the most powerful vehicle to convince other teachers, and yet it's very difficult for teachers to move around in the way that you do and I do, where we may visit dozens and dozens of schools virtually and physically in a very privileged position to see things that work. And it's very difficult to find ways to enable teachers to see how other teachers work and how other schools run, because that may be the most powerfully convincing tool that we have, rather than people like yourself and myself talking about what we've seen, a bit like Marco Polo, talking about our travels. So how do we enable teachers to meet other teachers?
I think, again, part of that is what we celebrate as well, in terms of a lot of the things that get celebrated are the traditional things. So the same things get shared on Twitter, on Facebook, on all the various platforms that teachers access, and it's the same, well, this school got an award for numeracy or literacy, and we don't really celebrate those really creative ways of doing things. And it takes events like this and people sharing, have you seen what happens here? And I think it's celebrating different things, and also then people that are in roles like myself actively connecting those people as well and taking that as a huge part of the responsibility. It's not just about collecting the stories. It's then saying, how do you connect? The ironic thing is, and I don't know if it is a Scottish mentality or the current situation that we're in, the schools that I work with have connections with Netherlands, Iowa, New Jersey, Australia, like people all around the world, and it is much easier to make those connections with people outside Scotland than it is to make them and maintain them with people inside Scotland. And I think that's something that needs to be explored as well in terms of why is it so hard for us to build those relationships and maintain those relationships within our country when there are people that are outside the country that are really engaged in what's happening in their schools, and there are people literally visiting from the other side of the world, and we can't get people within the same local authority to go and visit the school. So I think it's something, again, to be explored.
Any other questions for Stuart? I'm sure there will be. Maybe just an observation.
Maxine, is your hand up there?
Yeah, I've popped it in the chat, but it's probably worth expanding on a bit. You know, how do we genuinely recognise all achievement and not just your 5 A's at higher, and you get all the kids in the nice black shiny blazers out in front of the school and the press are there, and that's what the focus is on. So how do we really start to move away from that and look at that broader scope of achievement, which can be phenomenal, but it's just not recognised, and I just don't know how we shift that mindset. And I don't know if you've got any thoughts, Stuart, about how we can start to move that forward.
I mean, hopefully it's a conversation that is happening with people way more important than me right now, that can actually make that change. I think one of the interesting developments that I know Daydream Believers were presenting at this earlier on in the week is this creation of a creative thinking qualification, and changing that idea of qualifications being subject orientated to being much more about, so how do we either group skills together or make those sort of skills different. Again, my background is in sort of IB as well, where they do a much better job of how do we give children or young people the opportunity to show everything that they know, and that breadth and that depth of it in whatever context they choose to create, rather than sectioning off into subjects that we predetermine as these are the skills that are important to you. So I think the phrase is you get what you test, and I think ultimately you change that accountability, you change those tests, and everything then follows. So for example, if you were to suddenly change the exam to, well, we're going to do an exam on creativity, then the teaching would absolutely change. If we were going to do exams on active problem solving and it not being subject orientated, then you start to see people teaching problem solving in lots of different contexts. But I don't have the answer, but I would love to, again, it's one of those conversations that, as you say, it needs to be happening, because that accountability, that end point, is what influences everything that comes before it.
Yeah, it's just something that I think all of us need to keep pushing and asking the question about. I mean, we know we've got, I'm from a primary background, by the way, but I know we've got the higher maths, but we've now got the higher applications and maths qualification. They're both of equal value in terms of SEQF points. But we're already hearing narratives coming through about, oh, you're not good enough to do higher maths, you go and do higher apps instead. So, you know, it's again that sort of this valuing pure academia over qualifications that have actually got a practical and more useful application. So I don't know how we really, there just needs to be a huge culture shift in our education system moving forward, to value those broader qualifications and achievements that our young people are achieving.
Barbara.
Hi, Stuart. Thanks for this presentation. It's just been brilliant, so engaging and just really motivating and inspiring. Just an observation, you mentioned it yourself, the PISA assessment on creativity. And yeah, I think, it'll be very interesting to see if that makes a difference. And if it does, it's all well and good, but actually it'll happen for all the wrong reasons. Because as you say, we should be doing it because it works and makes a difference and an impact on learners and their lives, rather than because it's being assessed. But yeah, just a thought.
I think I find that the whole irony around OECD at the moment, around that whole idea of that the OECD report is influencing a lot of thinking in terms of four capacities need to be at the heart of what we're doing. We need to put this back at the centre of what Scottish education is about, and these are wonderful values to be pursuing. But they're also the same people that have PISA assessments that still focus on numeracy, literacy and science. And you think, how can you say one thing and still be measuring outcomes on the other? And I think there is that balance, that tension that until that absolute rethink happens, is always going to be that tension that is there.
I think it's interesting, though, you mentioned the refocus on the four capacities, which in itself, if we get it right, it could change huge. It really could be quite transformational. So I suppose we've got that going on in the background, but it's got to be more than just a nod to this time. There's got to be some real action and real some seismic shifts happening before we'll get any impact from it.
Absolutely, yeah. So if there are no more questions, I will wrap things up. I'll just give you a couple of more minutes if anyone wants to ask anything. I'm quickly going through the chat just to see if there was any put in there.
We have an evaluation form, which I think Amy's going to pop into the chat for us. Thank you.
Cool. I will just share one final conclusion then, prior to that. So, there we go. I have the tendency to I'm one of those people that watches TED Talks. Somebody mentioned it when they feel most creative. I'm one of those people. I have the tendency, though, to listen to those TED Talks or just famous speakers in general, and then draw my own entirely unconnected conclusions from what they said. So Simon Sinek, who I assume most people have heard of, talks about never trusting a leader with a messy bedroom, which does not bode well for me. But I told you that those big fancy speakers like metaphors, and that's a prime example. The main premise is that real leaders change things for the better. They should be changing the world for the better. And their bedroom is their little bit of the world that they have absolute control of, that they have domain over. So if they can't change that little bit of the world for the better, then why the heck should we be following them? And why on earth would we think they'll be able to change the world for the better? So what I take from that is the reality is our planet is the proverbial messy bedroom that we've left for the next generation to tidy. And we tell young people all the time that they can be the change, that one person can make the difference, and their creative thinking is what we need, and it's what the world needs. But then we still stick them into a system for 15 years that they can make no meaningful impact on and have no real influence over. And they come full of creativity and curiosity, and then over time we just force them to conform to our way of thinking or our way of doing things, the ways that created the mess that we're currently in. And remarkably convenient for my concluding point is that any three of the examples that you could have picked have made massive strides in shifting that paradigm, that they empower young people to authentically experience what it is to be creative and have creative influence. So the last thing that I would urge you to do is be inspired by what's been shared and think about how you can create those spaces that will nurture more dot-to-dot rebels, because that's what it's all about. So thank you so much for the questions and for listening. It has been great to speak with you all, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Stuart. I think my closing remark is, it was so good. I just want to hear about the other 2 schools now, please. So we'll book you in for something else in the future. Don't worry, you're not getting away. Thanks again.